Okay, so we have created our first app. So now the first thing I'd like to talk about is this Context API. So, what is Context API? All right, it's that time. Context API gives us a way to share state up and down a component tree quite easily. Sounds pretty good, huh? Actually, you can do that without the Context API. You can do that with props. But see, sometimes that can get a little bit messy, especially as your component trees and applications become bigger, right? So the Context API aims to solve this issue, and it's going to do that by giving us a central place to store data or state, then share it between components without having to pass it down as props. So it's going to make working with shared data much, much easier. Now, if you're familiar with Redux, this concept might seem a little familiar. It's an alternative to Redux, I would say. When we use it alongside hooks, it can behave very, very similar to the way Redux behaves. So imagine that we have an application with this component tree right here. So we have app component sitting at the root level, and we have the home component and the about component inside the app. And inside these components, we have some other components as well. Not too complicated components tree, just a few components. So then imagine we also have some state defined in the root component right here, and we want to share it with these subcomponents. Well, it's a bit of data that, well, maybe we just want to share with some of our components in this tree. So, for example, we want these four components: list view, menu, comments, and about contents components to use this data. So in order to make that happen normally, what we'll do is we pass that down as props right through every single component until it reaches every component that wants to use it. So it's these four here at the bottom. All right, so that's fine. We can do this, but what we're doing here is passing props everywhere, even through components that don't necessarily use those props. These components are acting as carrier components for props. They're just carrying the props from one component down to another. So it's okay. You can still do this. It's fine. But this approach can sometimes get a bit boring, and especially when there's a lot of components in the chain and the application gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I think you get the point, right? So the Context API solves this problem of having to pass props down to every and through every level, even through these components which don't use them directly. So what we could do instead of using this approach is to create a new context in a new file somewhere. A shared state could be initially defined and set up. So then when we create a context, we then have to provide it to our component tree so that the components in that tree can actually, well, access it and get the data that's inside of it. So for that, we are going to use the context provider, which is just a React tag, and it wraps whichever components need to access this state data. For instance, every component inside this tree, well, could have access to the shared state or data, but we don't have to use that data in each of these components. So no longer do we need to pass props down through the components. These components are not going to carry the data that they will never use. So we're just directly accessing the data from the context in the components which need it. So that's the basic sort of context or concept of Context API, right? You get it. It can make working with shared data so much easier in a whole lot of cases. So if we have a quick look at the context page here on the React website, we can see when we can use context in an application, because it might not always be the best solution to use. So look at this. It says right here that it's designed to share data that can be considered global for a tree of React components, such as the current authenticated user, theme, or preferred language, or maybe some other kind of data which is considered global from that particular tree of React components. All right. So if you're ever in a situation where you're unsure as to whether you should use context or not, just ask yourself this question. Is the data that I want to share global? And is it going to be used in several of the child components? And then if the answer is yes, then yeah, context probably is a good solution. If no, there might be other options which, well, will serve you better. For example, you can use props to share data between components, right? Context is just for global states that's shared between many different components in a tree. All right, so one more thing though before we start coding. In this course, I am going to be using the React developer tools for Chrome. It's just going to help us when we're inspecting states and props inside the application. So if you want to download this first, just go to the Chrome Web Store and search for React Developer Tools, and then click the Add to Chrome button and go ahead and install it. Then you'll be able to use it when I do. All right, so we've learned a little bit about the Context API and why we need it. We'll take a short break right here, and in the next lesson, we're going to create our first context and provider. So I'll see you in the next lesson.